Season 1, Episode 4, Magic Bullet is definitively the second best episode of the season. The first is yet to come. The episode opens with a woman driving alone in the middle of the night. She's our classic cold open victim, someone who doesn't take the news of the animal attack seriously before coming face to face with one herself. She's attacked by the Alpha, and this hapless young woman quickly turns into a well-trained soldier.
Come on! Come on!
As the night continues, Scott, Derek, and even Mr. Argent join the fray.
You're right, Kate just texted. I'm heading out to pick her up.
It's 2 in the morning. Is everything okay?
Yeah, she's just having a little car trouble.
This is Kate Argent, sister of Chris Argent and Allison's aunt. While Kate hunts down the Alpha, she manages to shoot Derek instead. Scott arrives just in time to learn that because of Kate's shot, Derek only has 48 hours to live.
If that.
The next morning, Allison finds Kate, and we get a sense of just how much Allison knows about the supernatural world, which is to say, not at all. Kate lies about the previous night, saying her car needed a jumpstart, but this conflicts with Chris's lie that she had a flat tire. At school, Scott catches Stiles up on the conversation he had with Derek in the previous episode about the Alpha and what it wants to do with Scott. We also start to see the mundane toll that being a werewolf has on Scott. He's starting to fail his classes. Derek, in worse condition than we last saw him, is searching for Scott at school. He comes across Jackson, who is obviously no help, and reacts to his aggressive questions by scratching him with his claws. Isn't anyone worried that an ex-convict is wandering around a high school? In the meantime, Allison and Lydia are discussing Scott coming over to study that afternoon, which Lydia claims is really just a guise for having sex. Also, Lydia shows another side of her intelligence.
I don't know. Can't explain it.
I can. It's your brain flooding with phenylethylamine.
Derek collapses in front of Stiles' car after school, drawing the attention of our secondary characters. Scott tells Stiles to get him out of here, and Scott is tasked with finding the bullet that injured Derek. With Derek's life on the line, we're reminded that he still has yet to earn Scott's trust, so this role reversal is really a way for them to begin that process. In the meantime, Scott meets Allison at her house to study, but there's a moment of hesitation before he enters her house. Part of it is because obviously he's entering the lion's den, but I also like to think it's because he's not used to a house this grand. An interesting thing to note is that Allison still hasn't really unpacked anything or painted her walls, showing how she still feels out of place in Beacon Hills. While they completely ignore their studies, Scott has trouble controlling his claws again before receiving a text from Stiles about finding the bullet. Meanwhile, Stiles tries to take Derek to his house, but Derek probably won't be safe there, and the two snark at each other until Stiles is threatened to continue driving. It's two of Scott's most important reflections interacting with each other, and I think the point of this is to put Stiles in a typically Scott-like position and continue to challenge his beliefs of what he thinks he would do if he were Scott versus what he actually does.
Start the car, or I'm gonna rip your throat out with my teeth.
Back at the house, Allison shares some details about her personal life, like how she used to want to be a photographer and other types of artistry before showing Scott how she used to be nationally ranked in archery, which is kind of terrifying given the family business. And speaking of the family business, we have an alibi for why the Argents might have so many guns. It's because they run a business selling them to the military.
So, I guess I should explain. We're not some sort of separatist gun nut family.
Sure they aren't. Chris interrupts, catching Scott and Allison together, tries to send Scott home, but is stopped by Kate, who strong-arms him into staying for dinner. Obviously, this is terrifying for Scott, who is now trapped with people who are trying to kill him, but any antagonism mostly comes from Chris, who in typical patriarchal fashion doesn't think Scott is good enough for his daughter. Allison becomes frustrated at his jabs, and Scott surprisingly is able to calm her down by taking her hand. It's a nice role reversal for Scott, who in past episodes has notoriously had trouble keeping his emotions in check. Derek and Stiles have apparently just been driving around for hours, and Scott tells them to go to Dr. Deaton's vet office. While Scott contemplates not saving Derek's life, Derek reminds him that the next time the Alpha calls out to Scott, he has no way of protecting himself and others from harm. After an awkward run-in with Kate, Scott finds a bullet in Kate's room. The inscription says that it is Nordic Blue Monk's Hood, which is a rare form of wolfsbane. Also, Derek tells Stiles that if Scott doesn't get back in time,
You're gonna cut off my arm.
Scott takes the bullet and tries to leave, but Kate again strong-arms him into staying a little longer. While discussing Scott's job at the vet, Chris begins a story about how he once had to deal with a rabid dog. Sparing the details is a long-winded metaphor for Scott's werewolf abilities.
It's a complete character reversal. This harmless animal turned into a perfectly vicious killer. And it all started with that one bite.
On the other hand, for Chris, it doubles as a justification for why he hunts werewolves.
Something that out of control is better off dead.
Finally, dinner is over. Scott gets ready to leave. Allison is deeply apologetic about her family, and Scott tells her it at least wasn't as bad as the time his parents told him they were getting a divorce, which is the first time we've learned anything about Scott's father. Just when Scott is finally in the clear, Kate stops him and asks Scott about stealing something from her bag. This line of interrogation always stresses me out until Allison admits that she stole something from Kate's bag, and she did. She stole a condom. Go Scott. In as equally exciting times, Stiles gets ready to saw off Derek's arm and be traumatized for life, but Scott gets back to the office in time. Before Derek can do anything with the bullet, he drops and it falls into a grate. At first I thought this was a cheap way to increase suspense, but I realized it's intentional by the way Scott gets the bullet. He's able to control his claws and extend them to pick up the bullet, which is in contrast to earlier in the episode when he was unable to control them from coming out when making out with Allison. Derek, whose life has literally been in the hands of 2 teenagers for the past 24 hours, is finally able to use the bullet for a cure and starts to heal. Scott, having paid his debts, tells Derek to stay away from them or else threatens to tell the Argents about him. It's interesting because Scott was previously terrified of this family, so I wonder why he would change his mind. Either way, Derek is offended and sheds some light on just how dangerous the Argents are. Remember the fire that burned down Derek's home? That was set by the Argents, and Scott, who thinks they must have been doing it out of self-defense, learns that there were innocent people in that house. Children, humans, and other werewolves who hadn't hurt anyone. The last remaining survivor, aside from Laura and Derek, is their uncle Peter, who lives in a catatonic state. It bothers me that Scott was so quick to defend the Argents in this way, but I guess the point of it was to motivate Derek to reveal some more backstory and to introduce us to his uncle. Meanwhile, Allison calls Scott, apologizing again before noticing the debris of glass that's coming from Kate's car. A broken window now conflicts with Kate's lie about a jumpstart and Chris's lie about the flat tire. So for Allison, the question is, what does her family not want her to know? The episode ends with Chris and Kate discussing the number of werewolves that they're dealing with. They deduce that as long as Derek is still alive, then he can lead them to the Alpha, and if they can kill the Alpha, then they can kill the pack.
And we do it according to the code.
You got the code.
It's there for a reason, Kate.
Of course.
Come on! Come on!
I always play by the rules.
The title Magic Bullet is a play on the word silver bullet. In common werewolf lore, and as Stiles points out, werewolves were known to be invulnerable to most forms of attack except that of a silver bullet. So far, we've spent each episode understanding and outlining how werewolves work in Beacon Hills. What we haven't touched on is the Hunters, or more specifically, the Argents. This episode is a character study of that family. While Scott's struggle with the werewolves is accepting this new part of his identity and learning to move past his trauma, the Argents as antagonists are primarily about protecting his identity, hiding who he is from Allison, from her dad, and keeping up this double life. Not just for other people's safety, but also for his own. This is a theme that extends beyond Scott. The question we've been wondering for some time now, whether or not Allison is in on this secret cult, is pretty much answered, meaning that both Kate and Chris hide parts of their identities from Allison and the rest of the town. The dinner scene is a good study of this idea. Every character in some way is saying one thing but alluding to another. Kate gives everything a double meaning. Scott minces words to keep the recent challenges in his life as unsuspicious as possible, and Chris, telling the story of the rabid dog, is alluding to the danger of werewolves. Which is interesting and a little bit confusing because as far as we know, Chris doesn't know about Scott's double life, so the impact of this speech and Scott's reaction is more for the audience than any particular character. I think Allison's hesitation about showing Scott parts of her personal life plays into this theme. It's trivial, but her moving through these phases of being a photographer or a painter or an archer is a small sign of her insecurities. Allison doesn't quite know who she wants to be yet and is still searching for that answer. It's probably why she has this not like other girls vibe going on, and I veer between seeing it as a subversive portrayal or being straightforward. What I mean is, so far, I can't tell whether Allison is meant to be not like other girls, or if that kind of limitation is a genuine identity she is grappling with. If she's not like other girls, then who is she? There's an interesting scene where Scott enters Allison's house for the first time. He hesitates at the door before stepping forward. With the tense music, you're meant to see this as Scott putting himself at risk by going into the lion's den. But if we project a bit, I think there are other factors at play. I've spoken before about how Scott is trying to attain the perfect life. Part of this is through Allison. By dating her, he is closer to that ideal. I think interacting with Allison's house and her family gives this another layer of complexity. Scott is from a working class family being raised raised by a single mom. This portrayal was intentional on Jeff Davis's part rather than just an aesthetic choice. Allison, in contrast, comes from a wealthy family, lives in a nice big house, and to Scott has the perfect family. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the same episode where we learn that Scott's parents are divorced, a contrast to the seemingly happy relationship between Allison's parents. So for Scott, entering the house, dating Allison, all of this is also an opportunity for upward class mobility.
Okay, we saved your life, which means you're gonna leave us alone. You got that? And if you don't, I'm gonna go back to Allison's dad. I'm gonna tell him everything.
You're gonna trust them?
A day ago, Scott was terrified of this family, and now he wants to be like them. Of course, the irony in this is that the Argents are hiding a pretty dark secret, and on top of that, they're lying to Allison. They may look like the perfect family, but they are anything but. And speaking of that lie, I love the way it slowly unfolds throughout the episode in 3 key scenes. The first is when Chris tells Allison why he's picking up Kate. The second is when Kate tells Allison a different story of why Chris picked her up. And the third is when Allison finds glass on Kate's car door, throwing a wrench into both of their stories. You can also see a hint of it when Allison talks about her family to Scott.
She had some car trouble, I guess.
The first season of Teen Wolf doesn't have a real theme, but it makes use of a song titled Of the Mountains by Dan Deacons instead. We first heard this near the end of the first episode, Wolf Moon, when Scott is left in the rain after being attacked by the Alpha. The second time is in this episode, when Allison finds the glass. The common thread is that these are defining moments for both characters and will be the catalyst for change going forward. The introduction of Kate Argent is one of my favorite scenes in this season. It's totally different from anything we've seen before and will see by showing the perspective of a completely different character for an extended period of time. The entire night is from Kate's perspective and only switches to Derek or Scott or Chris when their inclusion is necessary. On top of that, this opens the world beyond just Scott's point of view. There are forces more important than him at play. Kate doesn't even know who Scott is. Her contention is with the Alpha. The point is, it's a bold way to open an episode, and this trope of a clueless young woman being attacked out of nowhere is subverted by the way Kate responds. What this tells us is that she's not a character to be fucked with. Kate also strengthens the generational divide that I mentioned in episode 2, Second Chance at First Line. Between her, Derek, Chris, and I just remembered Peter, there's a ton of history that we clearly have yet to learn. And as we add a new character, we need to revisit the reflection theory that I proposed in the last episode. So, who is Kate a reflection of? I think for now we can categorize her as the darker side of Chris. From Scott's perspective, Chris Argent is an antagonist through and through. But within the Argent family, it's clear that Chris and Kate have very different ideas of what a hunter is meant to represent and how far they can go.
And we do it according to the code.
You and the code.
It's there for a reason.
Through this relationship, we also just get to learn more about hunters and how they operate. It's a totally different perspective from Scott and Derek because the Argents are the ones doing the hunting, but both have the same goal, to hunt down the Alpha. And you get an understanding why they feel so strongly about this profession in the first place, and it feels more like a defensive position. And I think as we learn more about the Argents versus the werewolves, I'm also trying to understand the ideologies at play. Most shows would use this as an opportunity to argue that hunting werewolves is akin to enacting racism, and that werewolves are a marginalized community. I don't totally agree with this projection because it has some ugly assumptions. Werewolves do present a real and actual threat. Meanwhile, people of color are often victim to racist incidents and institutions because of a perceived threat. That means that people of color are not inherently dangerous, they are only falsely portrayed as such. Scott is a person of color, the actor Tyler Posey is half Mexican, and Melissa McCall is intended to reflect that biracial heritage. But if we were to draw the parallel between werewolves and people of color, which is also questionable in other ways, we would be making the racist argument. I think there are other ways to understand and analyze Scott's position as a person of color in the narrative outside of this allegory. And within this allegory, I think there are different and better ways to make a connection between the struggles of people of color and the struggles of being a supernatural creature. But that's not the point of this video. On top of that, I don't think the show so far has tried to make this argument. The hunters are more of a loosely congregated militia, rather than the product of an institution that systematically oppresses werewolves. But I'm getting way too deep into this. My point is that I don't know what the real-life equivalent of this tension is yet, but I'd love to hear your theories and maybe this is something we can figure out together. The ending of Pack Mentality and the introduction of Kate in Magic Bullet kick off the second act of the season. In the first 3 episodes, we were focused on Scott, his new abilities, the aftermath of his assault, and how he was dealing with all of this. In the next act, we need to expand the world beyond Scott. We start learning about the Argents, the mystery behind Derek Hale, and how the rest of our characters begin to fit into this story. And of course, we still have to meet the Alpha.